Pawn e2 to e4. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d5. Pawn c2 to c4. Knight d5 to b6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d6. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn d6 takes e5. Pawn f4 takes e5. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop c1 to e3. Bishop c8 to f5. Knight b1 to c3. Pawn e7 to e6. Knight g1 to f3. Knight c6 to b4. Rook a1 to c1. Pawn c7 to c5. Bishop e3 to g5. Knight b4 to c2, check. Rook c1 takes c2. Pawn f7 to f6. Pawn e5 takes f6. Bishop f5 takes c2. Pawn f6 takes g7. Bishop f8 takes g7. Queen d1 takes c2. Queen d8 to d6. Knight c3 to e4. Queen d6 to d7. Knight e4 takes c5. Queen d7 to d6. Knight c5 takes b7. Queen d6 to b4, check. Queen c2 to c3. Queen b4 to a4. Knight b7 to d6, check. King e8 to d7. Pawn c4 to c5. Knight b6 to d5. Bishop f1 to b5, check. Queen a4 takes b5. Knight f3 to e5, check. Bishop g7 takes e5. Knight d6 takes b5. Knight d5 takes c3. Pawn b2 takes c3. Pawn a7 to a6. Pawn c5 to c6, check. King d7 takes c6. Knight b5 to a3. Rook h8 to g8. Knight a3 to c4. Rook g8 takes g5. Knight c4 takes e5, check. King c6 to d6. Knight e5 to f7, check. King d6 to d5. Knight f7 takes g5. Rook a8 to g8. Pawn c3 to c4, check. King d5 takes d4. Pawn h2 to h4. King d4 takes c4. King e1 to d2. Pawn e6 to e5. Rook h1 to c1, check. King c4 to d4. Rook c1 to c6. Rook g8 to g6. Knight g5 to f3, check. King d4 to e4. Knight f3 to g5, check. King e4 to d4. Knight g5 to a6, check. King d4 to d5. Rook c6 takes a6. Rook g6 takes e6. Rook a6 to a7. Rook e6 to g6. Rook a7 to d7, check. King d5 to a4. King d2 to c3. Rook g6 to g3, check. King c3 to c4. Rook g3 takes g2. Pawn a2 to a4. Rook g2 to c2, check. King c4 to b3. Rook c2 to f2. Rook d7 takes h7. King e4 to d4. Rook h7 to d7, check. King d4 to e4. King b3 to c3. Rook f2 to a2. Rook d7 to a7. Rook a2 to h2. Rook a7 to h7. Rook h2 to a2. Rook h7 to a7. Rook a2 to h2. Rook a7 to h7. Rook h2 to a2. King c3 to b3. Rook a2 to d2. King b3 to c4. Rook d2 to c2, check. King c4 to b3. King e4 to d3. Rook h7 to d7, check. King d3 to e4. King b3 takes c2. King e4 to e3. Pawn a4 to a5. King e3 to e4. King c2 to c3. King e4 to f4. Pawn h4 to h5. King f4 to e4. Pawn a5 to a6. King e4 to f5. Pawn a6 to a7. Pawn e5 to e4. Pawn h5 to h6. King f5 to f6. Pawn h6 to h7. Pawn e4 to e3. King c3 to d4. Pawn e3 to e2. Rook d7 to d6, check. King f6 to f5. Rook d6 to d5, check. King f5 to f4. Rook d5 to f5, check. King f4 takes f5. Pawn a7 to a8, promoting to queen. Pawn e2 to e1, promoting to queen. Pawn h7 to h8, promoting to queen. Queen e1 to d1, check. King d4 to c3. Queen d1 to g1. King c3 to d3. Queen g1 to d1, check. King d4 to c3. Queen d1 to g1. King c3 to d3. 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 King d3 to c3. Queen d1 to g1. King c3 to d3. Queen g1 to d1, check. King d3 to e3. Queen d1 to g1, check. King e3 to f3. Queen g1 to f1, check. King f3 to e3. Queen f1 to d1. Queen a8 to e4, check. King f5 to g5. Queen h8 to h4, checkmate.